Hello everyone, welcome to Barry's Book Reviews. This is episode number 35 and today I'm reviewing Diary of a Murderer and Other Stories by Kim Young-ha. It's a collection of 4 stories. I guess Diary of a Murderer is a novella, a short novel, and then there's 3 other short stories in this collection. And the Korean title is 살인자의기억법, and it's by Kim Young-ha, who we've mentioned several times before. I've reviewed a couple of his other books, and it's translated by Kryslee. And the Korean novel was originally published in 2013, and the English translation was published in 2019. And it's actually Kim Young-ha's 5th or 6th book that's available in translation. So his first book to get translated was I Have the Right to Destroy Myself. And then I think the next one was Photoshop Murder. And then I think it was Your Republic is Calling You. And then Black Flower. And then most recent before today's book was I Hear Your Voice. I Hear Your Voice was also translated by Kryslee. So today's book, Diary of a Murderer, it's their 2nd collaboration. Kryslee is not only a translator, she's also a novelist and short story writer. Her debut novel was called How I Became a North Korean, and she also has a fantastic collection of short stories called Drifting House. Both those are well worth reading. Anyway, so if you've watched some of the other reviews, you'll know I'm a big fan of Kim Young-ha. And you can actually see an interview with Kim Young-ha. He visited Seoul Book Club several years ago and he was interviewed. And he was interviewed by Kryslee. So please go and watch. There's 2 videos that you can see on the channel. So please go and watch the video with Kryslee interviewing Kim Young-ha. And today's book, so Diary of a Murderer, was adapted into a film in 2017. It's a fantastic film. The film is called Memoir of a Murderer, so they changed the title slightly. The film stars So Kyung-gu and Kim Nam-gil, and it was a very popular film. It was a big hit at the South Korean box office. And I think it's available on Netflix. It was definitely available on Netflix last year. And it has English subtitles as well. So I recommend reading the novel first and then go and watch the film on Netflix. Fantastic film. And lots of Kim Young-ha's novels get adapted into movies. His debut novel was adapted into a film, and Photoshop Murder was made into a film. His debut novel, I Have the Right to Destroy Myself, was made into a film, and I think he's written some films as well. So he has a very close relationship with cinema, with movie making, and his novels feel kind of cinematic. Like he obviously has influences. His influences aren't just literary. He also has influences, from filmmakers or film genres or film styles. And today's book is no exception. Diary of a Murderer has a kind of cinematic, propulsive, feeling to it, right? It's a crime story, there's just something sort of engagingly cinematic about it. I don't know how to explain it more clearly, but it's a story about a serial killer. And this is a serial killer who's in his old age. He's an old man, and he's slowly succumbing to Alzheimer's. And he's losing his memories. He's finding it difficult to remain completely aware of what's happening to him and what's happening around him. He can't remember if he's done things or not done things, and his mental state is deteriorating quite significantly. And how does he deal with this problem? The collection in general, Diary of a Murderer, isn't the only story, but all of these stories, they feature lots of, death and sex and violence and mental illness, betrayal. They're very bleak and pessimistic stories. They're definitely not for the faint of heart. But if it sounds like if you know a serial killer, an old serial killer with Alzheimer's, that sounds like something that you'd enjoy, then Kim Young-ha does a really fantastic job with that concept, and you'll probably like it. So how does he bring this killer to life? Right, he has the serial killer in the story. So it's an immediately gripping setup. It hooks you from the very beginning. And Kim is generally great at writing opening sentences, and that's a particular skill of a writer, being able to grab you from the first sentence. I think the Irish writer David Mitchell, he also has very memorable opening sentences, right? And being able to hook the reader from the first sentence, it's a skill. And Kim Young-ha is very good at it. And the first sentence in this story is, it's been 25 years since I last murdered someone, or has it been 26? And it really sets up the tone of the story and gives you some sort of clear idea of what it's actually going to be about. That actually reminds me, there's a Scottish novel by Ian Banks called The Wasp Factory, which has a similar introduction. I haven't killed somebody in several years. And that opening sentence, it also recalls this story, Photoshop Murder, which is a detective story. And the first sentence, the opening sentence in this story is, why do murders always seem to happen on Sundays? Which is another great opening sentence. So Kim, he's a writer who's preoccupied, or often preoccupied, with death, murder, and crime. Right, death, murder, and crime. And this story is just fascinating. I really loved it. The story is narrated by an old man. He tells us that as a younger man, he was a serial killer. He brutally murdered, many people in and around his hometown. And he started his career as a murderer by murdering his father, his abusive father, when he was 16 years old. But now he's an old man. He was never caught for any of his crimes. He was never made to account for them. He never went to prison. Nobody ever found out his identity. But now he's an old man. He's tired. He's retired. He doesn't kill people anymore. He hasn't done it in a couple of decades. And then at the beginning of the story, he's diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He starts to lose his memories. He becomes increasingly confused as the story progresses. To complicate the story, he also has an adopted daughter. And this daughter, she's perhaps the only person in his life that he's ever really cared about in any meaningful way. So this is the situation he's in, but then he has this other problem arises, and we're never 100% sure what the genuine reality of the situation is, but it seems like this. He starts hearing news that people have been getting murdered in his neighborhood again, echoing the crimes from 2.5, 3 decades before when he was active. He thinks, or he seems to think, he's certain that he's not doing it, right? He's not doing it. He sees these stories on the news and he thinks there's another killer out there. There's someone who's copying the crimes that he committed when he was younger. And he comes to believe that there's a new serial killer. There's a young serial killer, a young man who's a serial killer, and this young man learns his identity, and he wants to torment him in some way. And he does this by declaring his intention, or suggesting that he's going to murder the protagonist's adopted daughter. So he has to fight old age and Alzheimer's to try and kill this younger serial killer. It's like this duel or battle between these two serial killers, and he has to try and do it before the younger serial killer kills his daughter. And he's never certain of, he tries to put plans into motion, but of course it's difficult for him to plan or strategize because he can't trust his memories, and he can't rely on himself to follow through with the things that he wants to do. It's a wild plot, and one of the things that's enjoyable about Kim's books is you can see him drawing on all sorts of influences, or it seems like he's drawing on all sorts of influences. There's all sorts of different aspects to this story, and you can see sort of different things, Kim drawing different elements and different strands into the story. I thought a fun or interesting way to think about Diary of a Murderer, it could almost be a sequel to Bong Joon-ho's famous film about a real serial killer in South Korea. Called the film is called Memories of Murder, released in 2003, and it stars Song Kang-ho. And those murders went unsolved for a long time. I believe around the time when Bong Joon-ho's film Parasite was getting released, I think they did actually find who that murderer was, and somebody was arrested for it. But this story could almost be like a serial killer like that, or like the Zodiac Killer from the David Fincher film, a serial killer who had a long career, who murdered lots of people whose identity was never discovered. And now they're old, they're looking back, and they're reflecting on this career of murder and these awful things that they did when they were younger. And at one point in the story, there's a detective. He's been working in the region, the sort of town that Diary of a Murderer is based around, and he's near retirement as well. And he arrives in the story. He's tutoring some young police cadets, and they're investigating cold crimes. So they're investigating the crimes of the serial killer from 3 decades previously, and this detective, he just can't let go of the earlier murders that were never solved. And that character could be almost an older version of the Song Kang-ho character from Memories of Murder, right? If you remember, at the end of that film, we see Song Kang-ho, and he still sort of can't stop thinking about this case. It also reminded me of the Christopher Nolan film Memento, and in that film you have this man played by Guy Pearce, who has no short-term memory. And so again, he can't rely on himself to make plans or strategize for the future. And so he writes notes to himself, to remind himself of what he should be doing, like who he should be pursuing, who he should be chasing. And the protagonist of Diary of a Murderer faces the same problem, right? His ability to retain and form new memories becomes increasingly, fragmented. He's not certain of the reality that he's in. He has goals. He has to pursue this young man who he thinks is killing people, but he has to overcome this barrier of his increasingly fragmented mind. And he tries to use post-it notes as well, just like in Memento, but it's not a reliable method, right? Can he trust his post-it notes? Why did he write these post-it notes? What do the cryptic messages really mean? And it just makes for an extremely gripping and engaging story and engaging read. It's also, it was interesting that this book, it was translated and published in 2019, and around about that time there was this small cycle or small trend of translated Korean novels that were about serial killers or murderers, and what was the reason for that? And there were a couple of interesting similarities with a couple of those other Korean crime novels that were translated around about the same time. So there is a novel called The Good Son by Chong Yoo-jong, which I haven't reviewed yet. I'll try and review that sometime. And that story is also, you have this, it's narrated from the point of view of, someone who's unreliable, or an unreliable narrator. He has some kind of mental condition. You're made aware of that at the beginning of the story. And he may or may not have been murdering people. And in that novel, in The Good Son, that's about a young man who's at the beginning of their career as a killer. They're just starting out, they're just becoming a serial killer. And whereas in Diary of a Murderer, it's a man that's at the end of his career as a serial killer. And it's very interesting to think about those two books in connection with one another. And then there was another book that came out around about the same time called The Plotters by Kim On-soo. And that also was about a killer, that was a contract killer, a paid killer, but someone who was trying to leave that life of crime behind, trying to sort of maybe atone for the series of murders that they committed, and try and get out of their life of crime. And then there's another novel. This is the last comparison I'll make. There's another novel called The Woman with the Knife, and this is about an old woman who's a serial killer, and she's struggling with some of the same issues that the character in Diary of a Murderer is struggling with, right? She's old, she's beginning to slow down, and it's increasingly difficult to murder people. And so it's just really interesting and just a cool, fun thing to think about, this sort of little cycle of these, extremely violent and psychologically disturbing crime and serial killer novels that came out of Korea in the late 2020s. Why did that happen? I think it's the same reason that we have endless stories about detectives and murderers and killers, and the crime genre is so popular. Murder, it's one of the most transgressive things that we can do, right? One of the most transgressive things that humans can do, and so it's always interesting to look at why that happens and the motivation of the people that do it and the effect it has on the community and the people around them. And Diary of a Murderer, that central character is a great character. The problem that they have has these sort of inherent gripping, engaging elements to it, and it's just extremely compelling and horrifying as well. Like I mentioned, it's not the only story in this collection. Diary of a Murderer is the lead story in the collection. There's 3 more stories: The Origin of Life, Missing Child, and The Writer. And they're all very bleak stories. I might come back and review them individually at some point in the future. But like I said, they're populated by people having affairs, kidnapped children, abandoned babies, betrayal, violence, murder. And all of these stories, when you take them together, they paint this very cynical, sort of deeply cynical view of human nature. And it's a fantastic collection. Highly recommend it. If you like crime novels, if you like serial killer novels, this is definitely one to add to your TBR list. And that's all I'm going to say about it today. So Diary of a Murder, fantastic book. The film adaptation is also fantastic. And I'll try and review some more Kim Young-ha books in the next couple of days. But anyway, thank you for watching. Take care, and I'll see you in the next episode.